What are you waiting for, Sergeant? Salute me right now! That's what the American lieutenant colonel demanded, right there in front of everyone at the palace. But the answer he got from the Royal Guard, it didn't just make the officer quiet. It left the whole crowd absolutely amazed and taught everyone a lesson about army rules that nobody expected. Want to find out exactly what went down? First, give that subscribe button a click and leave a comment saying where you're watching from. Right then, let's get started. A line of smart black cars drove smoothly through the palace gates, pulling up neatly near the entrance used by visitors to Buckingham Palace. A gentle morning mist was in the air, making the old stone building look softer and making the bright colours of the perfectly kept gardens stand out even more. The palace grounds were busy, as usual, with a mix of tourists and official visitors. You could hear their excited chatter, a constant hum in the background as the day's events began. The cars had flags showing they were official visitors, announcing that the American Army Group had arrived for the yearly NATO meeting about leadership plans. People who were curious stopped to watch the formal arrival, many holding up their phones to take pictures. Lieutenant Colonel Gregory Sterling, from the United States Marine Corps, got out of his car. He straightened his spotless uniform with trained neatness. Every medal and ribbon pinned to it told a story of a long career fighting in different places around the world. His face looked professionally blank, but you could see in his eyes he was looking down his nose a bit as he scanned the palace grounds. He took in all the ceremony with impatience he barely tried to hide. All this fuss for what's basically just a fancy meeting, he muttered to Major Peterson next to him. We could have had this at the Pentagon and saved everyone this theatrical show. Major Peterson just gave a little nod, not really agreeing or disagreeing. He was already looking at the famous figure standing stiffly nearby, a royal guard in his full ceremonial uniform. The bright red tunic stood out against the old palace stone. Sergeant Alistair Finch stood completely still, his eyes staring straight ahead with that focused 1,000-yard stare he'd perfected over years of training. Sterling's eyes followed Peterson's, settling on Finch with clear doubt. Without any warning, he walked away from his group, ignoring the carefully planned arrival routine, and went straight up to the guard. He walked slowly around Finch, looking him over like someone inspecting a piece of army kit. "Amazing detail on the uniform," he said, not talking to anyone in particular. His voice sounded like he was sort of impressed, but also making fun of it. Though I have to wonder how useful that bearskin hat would be in a real fight. "Lieutenant Colonel?" A polite but firm voice interrupted. Mr. David Atkinson, who organized tours at the palace, came over with a polite smile that didn't quite look genuine. "If you wouldn't mind rejoining your group, we have a schedule that's timed very precisely." As the American group walked through the palace grounds, Sterling kept getting distracted. His eyes kept going back to the Royal Guard standing at different spots. "Tell me," Sterling suddenly said, cutting off Mr. Atkinson's explanation about the old types of roses. "These guards, they're just for show, aren't they? For the tourists?" Before Mr. Atkinson could answer, Sterling turned to his American colleagues. "It's like having shop dummies in uniform. Back home, our soldiers do actual work." Colonel Davies, the most senior American officer, frowned slightly. "The Royal Guards are a working battalion of the British Army, Gregory. They switch between ceremonial duties here and regular army jobs." Sterling raised an eyebrow. "Seems wasteful, having soldiers trained for fighting just standing there like statues. In the Marines, we make sure everyone's useful." Across the garden, Captain James Edwards of the Royal Guard Command saw the American officer gesturing towards Sergeant Finch's position. Having looked after the Royal Guards for 7 years, Captain Edwards had a knack for spotting trouble before it started. What Sterling couldn't possibly know was that Sergeant Alistair Finch had been chosen for duty today specifically because he was exceptionally disciplined and sensible. Only 3 months before, Finch had finished his 4th tour in a combat zone. He'd done outstandingly well in a secret joint mission, where his team had rescued important people carrying valuable information whilst under heavy gunfire. That mission had earned Finch the Military Cross for bravery, although the exact details were kept secret. His army record included praise from American Special Forces commanders who called Finch unflappable under extreme pressure, and noted his extraordinary discipline in chaotic situations. The very things that made him brilliant in battle also made him ideal for Royal Guard duty, where the mental strength needed to stay perfectly still for ceremonies matched the control needed on a battlefield. "I served alongside the Queen's Guard in Helmand Province," offered Major Sinclair, a British Army guide travelling with the group. "Some of the best soldiers I've ever met." Sterling gave Major Sinclair a doubtful look. "No offence to your soldiers, Major, but there's a world of difference between putting on a show and being ready for combat. These palace dummies might look smart, but modern war needs constant training and being able to change tactics quickly, not standing still for hours. We'll just pause here for a moment to look at the western side of the palace before we go on to the changing of the guard ceremony." Mr. Atkinson told the group. As people spread out a little to take photos, Sterling saw his chance. He slipped away easily, walking with clear purpose across the grass, heading straight for Sergeant Finch's post. Sterling stood right in front of Finch, deliberately getting in the way of the guard's fixed stare. "Impressive discipline," he commented, though his tone made it sound like he meant the opposite. "But I wonder what advantage you get on the battlefield from standing perfectly still while a possible enemy checks you out." A small crowd of tourists had gathered nearby, sensing something unusual was happening. Most visitors kept a polite distance from the guards, but Sterling got right up close, just an arm's length away. He looked Finch up and down with the critical eye of a sergeant major finding fault with a new recruit. "In the Marines, we train our men to react to threats, not ignore them," Sterling went on, walking slowly around Finch again. "This stiff ceremony might look good on postcards, but being effective in the army is about being adaptable. Wouldn't you agree?" Finch stayed perfectly still, showing no sign he'd even heard the challenging words. "Lieutenant Colonel," called Major Peterson, who had noticed Sterling was missing and had followed him. "The group is moving on." Sterling waved him away without looking. "Just having a professional chat with our British friend here." The way he said professional was clearly sarcastic. Peterson finally managed to pull Sterling away, but the Lieutenant Colonel paused, looking straight into Finch's eyes. "We'll talk more about this later, Sergeant," he said, getting the rank wrong based on Finch's uniform badge. "I'm interested to see how this ceremonial training works in a real military situation." The American group was about halfway through their tour when Sterling broke away yet again. This time, he did it so obviously and determinedly that even Colonel Davies shouting, "Lieutenant Colonel Sterling," didn't make him slow down. A bigger crowd had now gathered near the guard post as the mid-morning tour groups arrived with their cameras and guidebooks. Sterling stood directly in front of Finch, whose eyes stayed fixed ahead with perfect discipline. "Ladies and gentlemen," Sterling announced loudly, his voice sounding like a senior officer talking to his troops, "you're seeing an interesting difference in army thinking today." He pointed towards Finch. "This shows the British way valuing ceremonial neatness more than being ready for combat. In my 22 years with the United States Marine Corps," Sterling carried on, "I've led men in 3 war zones: Baghdad, Fallujah, and Helmand Province. Every time, our success relied on being adaptable, knowing what was going on around us and reacting immediately to changes." He turned towards Finch. "Tell me, Sergeant, how does standing still like this get you ready for the messiness of modern war?" An older gentleman wearing a blazer decorated with British Army medals stepped a bit closer. "Young man, you're behaving badly," he said quietly but firmly. "These guardsmen have served in the same war zones you're talking about. Their ceremonial duty shows discipline, not weakness." Sterling turned, quickly looking the older man and his medals up and down. "With all due respect, sir, I'm just pointing out different ways of thinking about army readiness. A soldier who spends hours practicing standing still isn't learning the tactical flexibility needed in war today." Sterling stepped even closer to Finch, crossing the line of respectful distance that other visitors kept. "You know what impresses me about American soldiers?" he continued, his voice loud enough for people nearby to hear. "When a Marine is spoken to by a higher-ranking officer, they answer. They react. They don't hide behind ceremonial rules." A woman in the crowd gasped as Sterling moved just inches away from Finch, so close that his next words were meant just for the guard, though others heard them too. "Have you ever actually seen combat, Sergeant? Or did they stick you here because you look good in a red coat?" "Lieutenant Colonel Sterling." Colonel Davis's voice cut through the tense atmosphere as he finally got free from his official duties. "Get back with the delegation immediately." The group's planned watch of the changing of the guard ceremony gave Sterling his chance. As the crowds moved around to get better views, he slipped away without being noticed, walking purposefully towards Sergeant Finch's post. By the time Major Peterson realized his colleague was gone again, Sterling was already getting close to Finch, whose perfect stillness hadn't wavered despite the earlier hassle. "Your ceremonial changing of the guard is quite a show," Sterling announced as he stood right in Finch's line of sight again. "Impressive dancing, I'll give you that. But in the Marines, we change posts efficiently, not with all this parading about. Let me tell you something about Army rules," Sterling went on, speaking loudly like a teacher giving a lesson. "Across all the NATO armies, everyone understands the chain of command. It doesn't matter which country you're from. Military politeness means junior officers must show respect to senior officers." He tapped the badge on his own uniform. "Lieutenant Colonel, United States Marine Corps. Medals for bravery from 3 war zones. Experience commanding joint forces." His finger jabbed towards Finch. "And you? What? A sergeant whose main skill is standing still?" Sterling started walking around Finch with the slow, measured steps of a drill sergeant inspecting a soldier. "Your uniform is impressive, Sergeant. Very historical." His tone made the word historical sound like an insult. He suddenly reached out and touched the sleeve of Finch's red tunic between his thumb and finger. Wool. In a combat situation, this would be a problem. The crowd grew tense together at him actually touching the guard. Everyone who visited the palace knew the main rule: never touch the guards. "He just touched him," a young American tourist whispered loudly to her friend. "You're not meant to do that." Sterling's hand moved towards Finch's rifle, his fingers brushing against the metal barrel as he commented, "Is this just for show, or does it actually work?" A noticeable murmur went through the gathered crowd at this second breach of the rules. Palace security staff were moving closer now, although they were still being careful because the visitor was military. Sterling stood squarely right in front of Finch, deliberately blocking his view, a third violation of the rules clearly written on signs for visitors. "The difference is reaction," Sterling continued. "A Marine Guard acknowledges senior officers, stays aware of what's happening, and reacts to changes." Sterling stood up tall, adopting a formal army posture that showed he was about to give an official order. "Guard," Sterling announced, his voice having that clear command tone of a senior officer. "I am Lieutenant Colonel Gregory Sterling, United States Marine Corps, NATO Joint Command. Agreed upon military rules across Allied forces require junior soldiers to show proper respect to senior officers. This is a direct order from a lieutenant colonel in the United States Marine Corps," Sterling stated, saying each word very clearly. "Salute me, now!" The demand just hung there in the quiet, like the sound of a gunshot. For a long moment, Sergeant Alistair Finch stayed perfectly still, his eyes fixed straight ahead with that disciplined 1,000-yard stare that hadn't flickered at all during Sterling's increasingly provocative actions. The change in Sergeant Finch's posture was so precise and controlled that people watching later said it looked almost robotic. 1 second he was standing in ceremonial stillness. The next, his white-gloved hand moved quickly and smoothly to push Sterling's fingers off his rifle. "Sir," Finch spoke. His voice was crisp and clear, the sound of British Army training. "You are breaking the standing orders about interacting with the Queen's Guard. Touching a guard or his weapon is a Category B security violation." Sterling's commanding expression changed to one of brief shock. He clearly hadn't expected any reply, especially not one delivered with such calm confidence. "Furthermore," Finch continued, his eyes now looking directly at Sterling's, "whilst your rank deserves proper respect within NATO allied forces, the standing rules here at the palace set out clear guidelines about the chain of command on royal property. The Queen's Guard answers directly to the Crown, not to the NATO command structure. Standing Order 157 specifically covers interactions with Allied military personnel," Finch stated, reciting it from memory perfectly. "Guards will maintain their position and bearing regardless of the rank of visiting military personnel, as their oath is sworn first to the Sovereign. My duty is to the Crown first, Lieutenant Colonel. That duty includes keeping my required position, bearing and following protocol, no matter the authority of external military visitors." His way of speaking stayed respectful but firm. "This isn't about disrespecting your rank, sir, but about showing absolute respect for the oath of service I have sworn." Finch's white-gloved hand went back to his rifle in a movement so smooth it looked planned, returning to his ceremonial stance with perfect precision. "I must respectfully ask you to step back to the marked viewing area and stop touching the palace guards or their equipment, Lieutenant Colonel." "Lieutenant Colonel Sterling," Captain James Edwards's voice cut the tension as he walked over steadily, "I think there might be a bit of a misunderstanding about the rules on palace grounds. Captain Edwards, Guard Commander." He introduced himself with a sharp nod. "I see you've been discussing protocol with Sergeant Finch." "Your guard broke his position to speak to me," Sterling stated, his tone implying this proved his earlier points about stiff ceremony. "Indeed, sir," Captain Edwards replied calmly. "Sergeant Finch followed Standing Order 157, paragraph 3. If there's physical contact or an immediate security issue, guards are allowed to respond with the minimum communication and action needed." His explanation was factual, not defensive, a perfect textbook response to what had happened. "The Queen's Guard works under a unique command system when on palace duty," Captain Edwards explained as they moved to a quieter corner of the grounds. "While we respect NATO command rules in joint operations, the palace grounds are under the direct authority of the Sovereign. This overrides the standard military chain of command for visiting officers." Sterling still looked stiff, his jaw tight as he listened. "In 30 years of army service across 4 continents, I've never met a junior officer who refused a direct order from a superior." "That's because Sergeant Finch wasn't refusing an order, Lieutenant Colonel," Edwards clarified. "He was following his primary standing orders, which state that on palace grounds his chain of command goes through the Crown, not visiting military personnel, regardless of their rank." A short distance away, the retired British Army officer who had spoken up earlier was explaining things to a group of interested American tourists. "The Royal Guards aren't just for show," he told them quietly. "They are active combat soldiers. Many have served multiple tours. Finch there served with distinction in Afghanistan, alongside American forces." Colonel Davies had finally found Sterling and walked up, clearly annoyed but keeping it controlled. "Lieutenant Colonel, the delegation is waiting for you," he said, his tone making it obvious this wasn't a suggestion. "Perhaps I can offer some background," Edwards said, talking to both American officers now. "The guards you see here today finished a 6-month combat tour just 8 weeks ago. Sergeant Finch himself received a commendation for his actions under fire during a joint operation with American Special Forces. The same men you see standing guard today could be sent to a war zone next month. Sterling's expression stayed doubtful. Different training ideas? He commented. As do we, Edwards replied smoothly, referring to tactical flexibility. But we believe the discipline learned from ceremonial duty supports combat readiness. It doesn't contradict it. Being able to maintain absolute focus and position while being watched by the public translates well to maintaining discipline under enemy fire. Colonel Davies nodded thoughtfully. An interesting point, Captain. I've seen similar benefits from drill precision in our own forces. Sterling shifted impatiently. With respect, sir, there's a big difference between drill discipline and standing motionless for tourists. Is there? Edwards questioned gently. Both need absolute control, perfect performance under observation, and putting duty before personal comfort. Colonel Davies ended the chat firmly. We need to rejoin our delegation, Lieutenant Colonel. Now. Ridiculous theatrical rubbish, Sterling muttered as Colonel Davies firmly led him back towards the American group. Standing about in bright red targets pretending it's military discipline. Lieutenant Colonel Sterling, Davies said then, his voice quiet but carrying the weight of a commanding officer who rarely needed to shout. You've caused a diplomatic issue during what was meant to be a simple goodwill visit. They rejoined the American delegation. Several officers glanced curiously at Sterling before politely looking away. British stubbornness hasn't changed since the old colonial days, Sterling remarked to Major Peterson, loud enough for nearby officers to hear. They hang on to outdated rules and call it tradition. The other American officers subtly moved away from Sterling as the tour went on, making his isolation more obvious. Across the palace grounds, Sergeant Finch held his post perfectly calmly. If the confrontation had bothered him at all, he showed no sign of it. The American delegation finished their tour and headed towards the gates where their cars were waiting. As they passed near Finch's post, several officers, including Colonel Davies, gave respectful nods, small signs of professional politeness that deliberately didn't include Sterling. They're soldiers, not statues, Sterling said as they got near the cars, his voice sounding defensive. Military effectiveness is about being adaptable, not putting on a show. An interesting viewpoint, Lieutenant Colonel, replied an American general who hadn't said anything during the earlier trouble. Although I noticed that Sergeant Finch adapted quite effectively to your challenge. His response was both correct and professionally handled. Sterling's face tightened. A rehearsed answer to a predictable situation isn't adaptability, sir. It's just following a script. Perhaps, the general considered. But it sorted out the situation decisively while following the rules. Tactical goal achieved with the minimum force needed. Sounds rather effective to me. As the line of cars pulled away from the palace gates, Sterling stared blankly out of the window. His reflection showed a man still certain he was right, even though nobody else seemed to agree. In the distance, Finch's bright red uniform remained a clear splash of color against the palace building. The guards' steady discipline was the final picture as the cars drove away. What does real respect for military traditions look like when different countries work together? Today's story shows how understanding different rules matters, more than just sticking to what you know when military cultures meet. Although Lieutenant Colonel Sterling thought he was showing proper military respect, he didn't realize that respect also means accepting different chains of command and areas of authority. The Queen's Guard is a great example of a unique military tradition where ceremonial perfection and combat readiness go hand in hand.